Have a copy. There's extra copy here. Nice to see everybody. Thank you for accommodating the earlier time. So our program is we're going to do. Hopefully, we'll get this discourse covered in two. Have a copy. There's extra copy. Hold on. Nice to see everybody. Thank you. I want to hear myself. Thank you. Hopefully, we'll get this discourse covered in two classes this week and next week, and then we'll have 1 week off during Pesach, and then we're going to be doing a 6-week Sunday morning course. Some of you may have taken the Kabbalah course. We're gonna do it again. It's free. It'll be it's a little bit more of an involved Sunday morning activity. It's from 10 to 11:30. It's a very it's a high level course, very fundamentals of Kabbalah. I'm going to be teaching the first 3 classes, and then Rabbi Edelman, who's taught here in the past, is going to teach the second 3 classes. So we do want you to sign up. We'll send out a text message about that, but it'd be wonderful for everybody to participate.
It's a very good class.
All right. Any questions before we get started? Existential questions. No, I'm not really inviting existential questions. All right. You can follow along in the English if you'd like, or in the Hebrew, or you can just listen, whatever makes you happy. This is a discourse from the Alter Rebbe, the first of the Chabad Rebbes, the author of the book of Tanya. This is from the book of Likutei Torah, which is a compilation of teachings on the weekly Torah portions. And there's also various discourses on the holidays. As Pesach is coming next week, we decided to, we, meaning me and myself and I, decided to do a discourse on Pesach, a very simple to understand, even though it has some very profound mystical Kabbalistic teachings, but a very basic question and a very beautiful answer that I think can provide some real takeaway for us. This discourse was recited in, give me a second, let me get my English date, so that would be 2011, so this would be 1811 on the first day of Pesach. And it was documented by the Alter Rebbe's grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek. Okay. Lihavin mipnei ma yom tov de Pesach hu bayom shenas ha'neis, ma shenkin b'Chanukah b'Purim shem b'yom ha'menucha. So the question of the discourse is, why is it that Passover is celebrated, that Pesach is celebrated on the day that the miracle occurred, as opposed to the holidays of Chanukah and Purim, which are celebrated on the days that they rested. So let's start with Hanukkah. Hanukkah, the war ended on the 24th, and they rested on the 25th of the month of Kislev. In fact, the Hebrew word for the holiday, Chanukah, amongst the different meanings of the word, Chanukah means dedication, education, but also there's an acronym within the word, Chanu, which means to rest, Chaf Hey, on the 25th. So there's an allusion to the fact that they rested on the 25th of the day of the month. Now, of course, Hanukkah is also about the miracle of the oil, but even the miracle of the oil began on the 25th, not on the day prior. But vis-a-vis the victory, right? There was a separate miracle. In fact, if you look in the prayers, we in the primary prayer that we actually say in the Amidah on Hanukkah, we almost barely reference the miracle of the candles, of the light. We really talk about the victory of the few over the many, the weak over the mighty, and so on and so forth. So really, Hanukkah is a miracle. The real miracle of Hanukkah is the victory over the mighty Greek-Syrian Empire. In fact, in Hasidic teachings, the fact that God performed a miracle with the oil was actually an expression of love from God, responding to the dedication of the people to be willing to fight. In other words, they went outside of their comfort zone. They went against logic to go wage war in the name of their faith against the great Greek-Syrian Empire. So God said, oh, you are so dedicated, I'm going to respond by performing this miracle where the oil that should only logically burn for 1 day will burn for 8 days. So, but the point of all this is that, good morning, that Hanukkah is celebrated on the day of rest. Now, if you go to the story of Purim, it's explicit in the Megillah. It says they fought on the 13th day and they rested on the 14th day. And then in Shushan, they fought on the 14th and they rested on the 15th, which is why in walled cities like Jerusalem, Purim is celebrated a day later. But the Megillah clearly states that they fought on the 13th and they rested on the 14th. In other words, the miracle of Purim, which again is the miracle of the victory over the enemy of the Jewish people, that is not the day that we celebrate the holiday. Now let's go to Pesach. What happened on the eve of Passover? So on the eve of the 15th, that is when they sat down to the Seder with the Passover lamb. And as the Torah tells them that they should sit with their belts on, with their shoes on, and their sticks in hand. And at midnight of the 15th, that's when God struck the firstborn, the Egyptian firstborns. Pharaoh comes and says, go. And eventually the Jewish people leave at the break of dawn, according to most opinions. But the miracle took place on the 15th of Nisan. That's when the victory, so to speak, took place. And not the 16th when they rested. In fact, if you read in the text, the real freedom didn't take place until they came to a place called Pi Hachiros, which was these two massive rocks. I imagine they were probably like a mountain pass. And it says no slave ever passed that area. So when the Jewish people came to that place, they were considered free. Pi Hachiros means the mouth of freedom. So if we're following this practice that the Jewish people celebrated Hanukkah after, even though this happened later, but at least if we look at the structure, Hanukkah was celebrated on the day of rest. Purim is celebrated on the day of rest. Why isn't Pesach celebrated on the day of rest? That's the question of the discourse. So you want to know the answer to this question? We got to talk about some mystical stuff. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about something called memale and something called soiv. We're going to elaborate in great detail what this is all about. But just in a very general sense, the word memale means to fill. You know how you call a dreidel in Hebrew? How do you say dreidel in Hebrew? That's Yiddish. Sivivon, right? What is this? Sivivon. The root of that word is saviv, right? Saviv means to go around, to encircle, to encompass. Male means to fill up. So mimale means to fill. So remember these terms. Mimale means to fill. Soiviv means to encompass, to surround. Mimale pirush or v'chayis hanimshach mimadrega lemadrega olam hanashamis. Mimale, to fill, means we're referring to the light of God that descends from level to level. Olam hanashama is the world of souls, v'achar kach malachim, and then the world of angels, ad shenimshach ba'olam hazeh hagashmi, until it draws down into this physical world. I will elaborate. Fear not. Mekabel me'ayin sarim. It's known that this world receives from the 70. Did I not record this? Shoot. We're just going to have to let that go at this point.
You can do a quick
a recap.
one sentence. So far, you said.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to let it go. All right. So I'll do a 60-second recap. So the question of the discourse is, why is Hanukkah and Purim celebrated on the day of rest? The Jewish people fought and the war ended on the 24th, and the 25th of Kislev is when they rested. Purim, the Megillah tells us explicitly that they rested on the 13th, they battled on the 13th and rested on the 14th, and in Shushan they battled on the 14th and rested on the 15th. Pesach, the exodus from Egypt, which is the day of the ending of the battle, right? They left after sitting at the Pesach Seder on the eve of the 15th. We don't rest on the 16th. We don't celebrate on the 16th. We actually celebrate on the day that the miracle occurred, which is the day of the 15th. So this is the question of the discourse. The Alter Rebbe explains that the Alter Rebbe says he's going to explain the answer to this question by understanding the difference between memale and soiviv. Memale means to fill up. Soiviv means to encompass. What does it mean to fill up? So memale pirish arvachais hanimshach mimadrega lemadrega the light of God that descends from one level to another level. Olam hanashamis, the world of souls. V'achakach malachim, and then the world of angels. Until the divine light descends into this physical world. As it's known that this world receives from the 70 spiritual ministers, I'll elaborate in a moment. The ministers receive from the angels, Gavaya me'al Gavaya, one level higher than the next, Sha'alav that is upon it. So, what does this mean? This means as follows. The divine light, Hashem's presence, Hashem's essence, is too powerful to be a direct manifestation to bring others into being. And for those others, that otherness, to coexist with God's essence. You know, this sometimes when we learn these teachings, it can seem very abstract. I want to make this very real. If you read my my email last week, 2 weeks ago, or my post on Facebook about our trip to Israel, something struck me when we were on our way to Keva Rachel, to Rachel's tomb. One of the shluchos, one of the Rebbitzins that were on the trip, gave an introduction as we're nearing Keva Rachel, and she said something. She quoted the verses about Rachel's tomb, and I heard something that I never really heard before. Right, the focus usually when we read those verses is the fact that Rachel is buried on the side of the road, and she chose not to allow herself, so to speak, to be buried in a proper place so that she could pray on behalf of her children when they're going to go into exile. And what's the focus? The focus is that Rachel cries for her children. And God says, don't worry, there is reward for your efforts, that the Jewish people will eventually return. But there's two words, I think it's 2 or 3 words in Hebrew, where it says that Rachel refuses to be comforted. So what does that mean, she refuses to be comforted? So I was thinking about this when this Rebbitzin was saying it, and I was, you know, the trip was an extremely raw trip. We went to places and saw things and interacted with people that no human being should ever have to experience what our brothers and sisters experienced on October 7th, and unfortunately even after that. When you come face to face with that, you're naturally, your emotions just are torn up. Now, what happens when we get emotional? What happens when we get emotional? What do people do? They cry, okay? And what happens when you start crying? What's the next thing you typically do?
Tears.
And then, what's the next thing you do?
Yeah.
Okay, but even with the crying itself, what happens when somebody starts crying? Do you just let it go?
Yeah.
You try to control it, right? You grab a tissue, you whimper a little bit, you try to stop the crying, right? And what happens? Other people, they see you crying, they immediately give you a tissue, right? They try to give you a hug. Emotions are extremely intense within ourselves and for others. I once listened to I taught a class once. We're going to hopefully do it again maybe this summer on the 12 steps of recovery from a Jewish perspective. So I was looking for material, so I was listening to some podcasts. They call them sober podcasts, whatever. So I heard by the way, it's just, if you want good comedy, listen to some of the 12-step podcasts. The people in recovery are the most self-deprecating. It's hilarious. Anyway, this woman gets up to speak at some kind of conference. I forget which step she was going to talk about. And she says, you know, when I get started here, all you do-gooders in the front row, I know that as soon as I start crying, you're going to come running up here with your tissues. She says, don't. I appreciate the goodwill, but don't. She says, I believe that tears are God's way of trying to get in or God's way of trying to get out. Don't interfere with that. That's very profound, right? When we experience emotion, it's extremely intense. And that's what, it's so intense that we don't want to be with it, right? We want to shed it. So we whimper, we try to stop it. Other people being exposed to that have a hard time with it, right? It's hard to see that level of emotion coming from someone else. So we try to calm them down. It may be coming from a place of consideration and love for them, but it's also because it's hard to be in the presence of that, right? You ever go to a shiva house and the person is expressing themselves, and you want to say stuff that'll make them feel better. Maybe not. Our tradition actually says that for the first 3 days, you don't speak unless you're spoken to in the home of a mourner, because let them be. And that's hard for us to be present and let someone be in their emotions. So what struck me is that when Rachel says that she refuses to be comforted, she's basically telling God, don't give me any candies. I don't want your hugs. I don't want your tissues. I don't want any candies. I want results. I am crying for my children. I want a different outcome. The reason why I give this as an example is we can see that even human emotions are very difficult to be in the presence of, let alone divine revelation. God reveals himself. We can't be present. We lose our consciousness. We melt into that consciousness. So how could there be this beautiful universe with all of the wonderful things that are in it and all the complexities that are in it? How could that universe come into being if God's essence is bringing that into being? And therefore, the Kabbalists tell us that God uses a process of tzimtzum, of contraction and concealment, to bring his light in a condensed way, in a concealed way, into the universe, into the spiritual universe and then the physical universe, to bring the world into being. And now within this, and that's what he talks about here, the world of souls, the world of angels, then the 70 ministers, and then the physical reality, which we'll elaborate on that in a moment. But there's this process, there's this descent of this divine light becoming more concealed and more condensed, channeled until our consciousness comes into being. Now, there's 2 dimensions to this consciousness. There's one dimension to this consciousness that's very tailor-made. It's very specific. It's very specific. Angels need a certain amount of divine consciousness. Souls need a different level. Physical reality needs a different level. The difference between this cup and this piece of paper and the human being and the animal, they're all different levels of divine consciousness that are necessary. If you take a 220 voltage machine and you stick it into a 110, it's not going to get the power it needs. And if you take a 110 and stick it into a 220, it's going to blow up. Right? Everything needs to be tailor-made. And because we are, even amongst human beings, we're complex. Our physical and emotional, psychological makeup is so unique to each of us as individuals. And the divine energy that you receive and that I receive cannot be the same. It has to be tailor-made. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to function. You wouldn't be able to function. So this process of divine light being tailor-made for each creation. And this is just in the physical reality. In the spiritual reality, you have different angels and different types of angels and different types of souls. Everything needs very specific. This is called memale. This is when we say God fills the earth, God is filling each creation according to its unique needs, according to its unique makeup, its unique physique, its unique spiritual makeup, so that it can function in the way it needs to function. Now, the specifics of this is that you have first the world of souls, then you have the world of angels. Souls are the highest, then you have the world of angels, and then you have this notion of 70 ministers. So 70 ministers, in Jewish tradition, there are 70 nations, right? The Jewish people are called a sheep surrounded by 70 wolves. 70 nations, they represent, there's a physical reality of 70 nations. If you look at the end of the Torah portion of Noach, the second portion of the Torah where the Tower of Babel, the nations spread from there. There, the Torah lists the 70 nations, and whatever nations we have today are basically subsidiaries, they're byproducts, they're offshoots of those 70 nations. But spiritually, these 70 nations in the physical world are a manifestation of the 70 ministers in the spiritual world. And these 70 ministers are the channels through which all flow comes into this physical reality. All flow comes through these 70 ministers, these spiritual ministers. So the physical, and it's elaborated on in many discourses, but even the physical matter, food, sustenance, pleasures that arrive in this world are channeled through these 70 ministers until they arrive in this world. So that's enough for today in relation to the divine energy that fills the world. Now we're going to go to the light that encompasses the world, but first let me make sure that all landed well. If there are any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Where it mentioned souls, that's the souls that we're familiar with. Our souls.
Yes.
That's the world of souls.
Yeah, it's called in the spiritual origin, it's called an otzer, a treasure house. God has a warehouse of souls, and that's that's called an otzer, a treasure house. So all souls. Now, that's oversimplified, because there are layers of souls, and souls, as they descend, they take on different properties. Certain souls end up being higher, not in origin, but in manifestation. But ultimately, all souls originate in this olam hanashamas, this world of souls.
In Yiddish, Oitzer, is it the same word? Oitzer?
In what context do you have the word oitzer?
You know, a grandmother would refer to the grandchild as Oitzer.
I never heard that used that way,
Okay.
but I would imagine that's what it is. Oitzer means a treasure house. Yeah, yeah.
Brother, I was gonna ask you a question, not to get off the top, actually, it is on the topic.
It's okay.
But we said
We do that here.
There's the angels, no, there's the souls, the angels, it permeates, boom, 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 and then the 70 nations, and then it comes to the physical. So why does Hashem sometimes overpass everybody? Come directly, let's say he smite all the firstborn himself. Why didn't he go through this process as opposed to even talking to Moshe? You know, and you have other instances as well, you know. I just had
Yeah, it's a great
I
question.
don't want to get off the top, but
No, it's a great question. So I'm going to say two things. First of all, your question is good, but you can ask that question about the very next thing the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about, which is the encompassing energy, right? The encompassing energy is also not through the normal process, which we'll talk about in a moment. But you know, you have in relationships, right? You have what you might call the regular functional dimension of a relationship, right? Let's just say in a marriage, right? So we talk, we debate, we take care of technical things in our collective life, we philosophize, we play games together, we listen to music, right? You do all the stuff that's all, I don't want to say surface, but it's more external. And then you have moments of intimacy. You don't live perpetually in a state of intimacy, but there are moments of intimacy. There are moments where the essence, the pure exposure of the relationship is exposed, right? They're both necessary, because we can't live in a perpetual state of intimacy. But without intimacy, then the external dimensions of relationship just become that. They become external. So you have to constantly infuse it on occasion with intimacy. The normal function of the world is just that. It's the normal function of the world. God operates. There's this process. There's a flow. There's what we call teva, nature, right? What is nature? The word nature in Hebrew, teva, also comes from the word tovea, to sink in. And our sages say teva is the process, the pattern that God sunk into creation. He embedded a process into creation, right? There is a natural flow that God created. Things have to operate. We can't live in a perpetual state of miracle. But without miracle, without divine revelation, without these moments where God appears to Moses, or God appears to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, or dare I say, you know, I think we have to keep our eyes very open, right? And say what happened last night is a miracle. It's not to be taken for granted. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's part of Iran's failure, but it's a miracle. 300 projectiles, whatever these things are called, were sent to Israel, and no one got killed. And the damage is almost non-existent. One army base, unfortunately, a 14-year-old girl was wounded, severely wounded. But imagine that. I mean, that's a miracle. So the naysayer is going to say, no, Israel, they're very smart, and they had great defense systems, and the UK helped, and the United States helped. And yes, those are all true, but it's a miracle. So let's open our eyes and say, wow, okay, we should never have had this situation, but can we see the hand of God? We need to open our eyes and recognize that. We have to recognize God's presence, because what that does is that when we're not seeing that, and we take a cup of coffee, we say, hey, this is not in a vacuum. there's divine purpose here. God's present here. Let me say a blessing. This interaction that I'm having, it's not chance, it's intentional. Even though I'm not seeing the miracle right now, I'm not seeing the revelation, but this interaction is not by chance. There's purpose, there's intentionality in it. So we need to have those moments where God bypasses it. In many of those moments, there is a specific agenda, right? The revelation of the Torah or empowering Moses with his charge. But zooming the camera out, we need those moments of miracle to remind us that the moments of non-miracle or miracle within nature is also by divine structure and has purpose. And it's our job to find the meaning in that, to find the purpose and to infuse it with godliness. Yes.
Said about when we cry, we have tears. Is God?
It doesn't come from a Kabbalistic source, so it's from this podcast, but I think it's legitimate. It's either God trying to get out or God trying to get in. Okay, let's move to Soiviv. So that's all Memali, right? That's all the personal relationship that we experience. Soiviv, the encompassing light, is where the light does not descend level by level. Rather, it comes to everybody as one. Meaning that this is not a tailor-made divine light. It's a collective, single manifestation light. Let's use his analogy and then we'll fine-tune it. Al derech mashal b'nefesh. Let's use the analogy of the soul. Yesh gamkein beis mine hashbas hachayis. There are also, within our soul, there are also two types of transmissions of energy from the soul. Aleph, hanimshach mimadrega lemadrega misechol amidas. The first is the light that descends from level to level, from intellect to emotion, umimidas lemachshava, and from emotion to thought, conscious thought, umimachshava ledibor, and from thought to speech. Right? So there's a process. The soul is expressing itself, and it goes through a process, an internal process, until it begins to manifest itself externally. I don't know that we have to elaborate too much on this, because we all can identify that when we take the time to think about what's coming out of our mouth, right, there's a process that precedes it. And that process is a gradual process. We think about it, we contemplate it, we bring emotion to it, and then we express it. So that's the first, that's mamali, that's the dimension of godliness that fills. V'habeis, and the second, hameir al kulam ke'echad, that is when the soul manifests itself to everybody as one, without going level to level in an orderly fashion. V'hu, and we see this in real time, shanuraim, that we see, as I tifal regel miyad. I want everybody to put their hand on the table for a second. Okay? Everybody lift your hand. You didn't lift your hand. You had to push back. So what? You can put your hands down. What happened? There was no brain. The technical functionality of the brain was at place because we have a nervous system that has to ultimately do the act. But in terms of the human functionality, did you think about it? Did you process it? Did you engage in an analysis? Should I lift my hand? How should I lift? You just lifted your hand, right? We do that a million times a day. In so many, your eyes blink and you walk and we don't even think about it, right? So there is a dimension of the soul's energizing the human behavior that bypasses that whole internal system. It just is. Right, and that's true whether we're moving our hand or our feet or our ears or our eyes. It doesn't make a difference. In other words, that dimension of the soul's manifestation is equal in the entirety of the person. As I tifal regel miyad, so the foot moves immediately. Kirega mamish meblishi azman ma atshiyumshach ba'ha'ara min hamayach ayidei shtashos keseder hamadreges, without it needing to illuminate the brain. I'm sorry, without waiting. Without pause, that it needs to go through the brain, and then it has to go through all these levels until it manifests itself. We're on top of page 6. So in this case, what he's telling us is that the soul has a relationship throughout the body that doesn't require a processing. It just is. It's there equally. So so similarly, above in the spiritual realms, we also have two flows. The first we mentioned earlier at length, memale kolamin, the light of God that fills all the worlds. This is the ray of divine light, which is revealed in a tangible manner. The nimshach keseder hamadreges, and it descends in an orderly fashion through the levels. And regarding this, in Isaiah and Yeshaya, it says, that God's glory fills the earth, right? What is glory? Glory means a radiance, which I'll elaborate in a moment. But the point here is that there is a dimension of God that fills. It's personalized, and it's called glory. What is, or the actual translation of kavod means honor, right? What is honor, or what is glory for that matter? It's not the thing itself. Right? I am who I am, whether you honor me or not. You are who you are, whether somebody honors you or not. It's actually a really important point. Because in our times we've lost that in great part. I am who I am because I am. Right? My identity is pure and connected to God and whole, whether you recognize it or not. And the more I can know that, the healthier human being, the healthier I can function in this world. If I'm dependent on your recognition and your acknowledgement, then we got a problem. Nonetheless, honor is important because the recognition is good for the one recognizing and the one receiving the recognition, because we don't always live in that essential place. Or to use glory in the context of kingship and royalty, right? What gives the king power? It's the ray, it's the shine, it's the glory that lives around the king that gives the king the power that people will actually listen. It's not the worthiness of the king, but it's the effect of the king. When we give respect, then your worthiness becomes felt and experienced by others. So respect is important. Respect and honor is important both for the giver and for the receiver and for the impact that it makes. The point being, though, is that, as we said earlier, it's not God's essence that gets manifest, but it's God's light, it's God's glory, it's God's honor that ultimately is what translates down to fill the world. For that personal relationship, it's God's shine, it's God's ray that ultimately that we can be in a personalized relationship with, because God's essence is too transcendent. And again, if we were looking for biblical sources for this idea, this is the verse from Yeshaya, from Isaiah, God's glory fills all of the earth. Meaning it's the ray of God's light that ultimately is where the personal relationship takes place. That's the mamale part. But the encompassing light, that does not reveal itself literally, only in an external manner. And even that external manner, it's not in an orderly manner. Meaning it doesn't take into consideration the individual. It's just present. And everybody is equal before this revelation. Neshamas umalachim, souls and angels. Ruchnius v'gashmius, spiritual and physical. Vafilu klippos, and even the realm of the unholy is also equal before this presence of Hashem. Let me read the next little paragraph and I'll elaborate. Like the verse says in Yirmiyah and Jeremiah, again, here we see a source in Torah, as Hashemayim v'ha'aretz ani mole, the heavens and the earth I fill. What does it say here? Ani, I, mahusei v'atzmusi yizbarach. It doesn't talk about God's glory. It's talking about the eye of God. God himself fills the earth and the heavens. And he doesn't distinguish between earth versus heaven, as we said in the earlier verse, where we said God's glory fills the earth. Here he says that God says, I fill the heavens and the earth. Because who's the eye? The eye is Mahusiv Atzmusi Yizbarach, the essence and the beingness of Hashem, blessed be he, Malei Hashemayim va'aretz b'shav mamish, fills the heavens and the earth equally. So let's elaborate a little bit what this means. There's a passage in the prophet where the prophet says that im tzedakta matiten loy, if you do righteous, what is God going to give you? V'rabu p'shacha matasaloi, and if you do abundant sin, what is God going to do to you? It seems like the prophet is saying like it's all insignificant. Like if we do good, what's it worth? If we do bad, what's it worth? But the prophet is telling us something deeper. And it's a question that you often hear people ask. So we're not allowed to turn on the lights on Shabbos. He said, does God really care? Does God really care if I turn the light on or off on Shabbos? And the answer is no. And yes. What do we mean? God is bigger than your light switch turning on or off. There's a dimension of God that not only you're turning on or off your light switch is insignificant, you are insignificant. Because God is so much bigger than all of creation. God's essence is transcendent. Especially when we understand that creation comes only from a ray of God, right? It's like thinking about one ray of the sun, right, brings this light into the world and heals and grows plants and so on and so forth. And the sun has been shining for thousands of years. The sun, does the sun care about the light that comes into you? If you decide to have a little bit more of an opaque curtain or not, does the sun bothered by it? The sun could care less. It's irrelevant. It's insignificant. It's just a ray coming from it. So the fact that you and your friend are arguing where to put the plant so it receives the best sunlight, the sun says, don't get me involved. Like I could care less about your discussion. You do whatever you want. So there's a truth to that. And we'll come back to that truth in a moment. The reason why it's significant is not because it is significant, but because God chose for it to be significant. When God chose to create and God chose to conceal himself and condense himself to bring a world into being, God said, you're important to me. And that cup is important to me. And that tree is important to me. And that's why I'm going to give each of them life according to their needs. That's the mamale, that's the light that fills. But fundamentally, all of it is insignificant. All of it is equally energized. And in relation to that equal energizing of existence, that's the soiviv, that's the encompassing light. It says, as a Shemayim v'sa'aretz ani mole, I fill all of it, God says. Meaning it is irrelevant, the difference between good and evil, between heaven and earth. It's all equal before that dimension of godliness. So you have these two relationships that exist. There's a relationship that's a transcendent relationship, and there's a relationship that's a personal relationship. By the way, it's not to say that the transcendent relationship doesn't ultimately manifest itself with these delineations. Evil is significant. It does need to be eradicated. Heavens is heavens and earth is earth. But if we can pause for a moment and realize it's not because it is that way, but because God chose it to be that way. God's bigger than that. But because God chose it to be that way, that's why it becomes significant. But in terms of God's being bigger than that, that's the encompassing light. And because God chose for him to be in this personal relationship, therefore God fills the earth. I'll give you one other parallel that I think is another one that we can possibly internalize. There's a difference between the amount of life that a baby has and that a young adult has, and a middle-aged person, an elderly person. But the person who's sitting on their deathbed, whose heart is still beating, whose brain is still functioning, is just as alive as that newborn baby. There's a component of life that's equal for all living things. That's the encompassing light. And then there's the personalized life. Yes, the child has different life than the person on their deathbed, and the young adult who's more energized in the prime of life. Yes, there are different levels of energy, and there's different levels of spontaneity and levels of consciousness and so on. That's the mamale. That's the light that fills. But there's this essential light, the idea that I am alive. We are all alive equally on one dimension. And then we're all alive differently based on our own unique components and so on and so forth. Yes, Stanley.
This paragraph, I think you're focusing on right now, but I think it's a Sauvé concept.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit distracted by this use of the word fill in that.
Yeah.
Are we combining both there, or are we still Sauvé entirely? It's just.
Yeah, so fill here is a different type of fill. So there's fill, when we say that God, that the coffee fills this cup, right? So there's the right amount of coffee that's fitting into this cup. But then there's fill, meaning there's no space that God isn't. God fills all of space because there's nothing that is not God. So it's not filling because the world is a vessel for God. God fills everything because there's nothing that's not godliness. So it could be misleading. It's a legitimate question. But the point here is that God fills everything. Everything is godliness.
In a surround sense.
The surrounding also, you're thinking very linearly because that's how the human mind thinks, but encompassing, surrounding also doesn't mean surrounding. It means not personal, right? You can fill something up and it's not personal. In the linear thinking, we think of something surrounding, meaning that we think of that imagery of something surrounding it's depersonalized because I'm not grasping it, I'm not holding it. But God doesn't surround any more than he fills. God doesn't need God doesn't channel this energy. I'll give you another way to look at this. When in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that when we study Torah, the Torah is inside of us and it surrounds us at the same time. Right? What does it mean the Torah surrounds us? Right now, I'm engrossed in Torah. Does that mean the Torah literally is surrounding me? It means that there's a dimension of Torah that I am processing, and there's a dimension of Torah that I'm buoyed by. I'm lifted by it. It's affecting me. Yes, it does mean it's inside of you because it's inside your brain, but it means that you've internalized the Torah. But it also means that the Torah is encompassing you, not because it literally is surrounding you, but because it's affecting you in a way that's not internal, even as it's affecting you in a way that's internal, which the Alter Rebbe concludes that there's no union like that in the physical universe, that something could be both encompassing and internal at the same time. When we look at something, we process through various different dimensions. We process things emotionally, we process things intellectually, and if we're spiritually in tune, we can process things spiritually. Are we engaging with that thing differently in a physical way? We're not. We're engaging with it in an ethereal way differently, right? I'm connecting with something emotionally or intellectually or spiritually. But the way I'm affected by that is different, whether I'm experiencing it emotionally, intellectually, or spiritually. And therefore, one could say when I'm experiencing it spiritually, it's more encompassing, whereas when I'm experiencing it emotionally, it's more personal. But nothing's actually changed in terms of the relationship, the physical relationship between me and the experience. It's all intangible. So when we talk about God encompassing, when you asked your question, Payman, you used physical, you made a physical emotion that God bypasses it. Does God need to bypass this internal flow in order to relate to Moses? He doesn't need to bypass, because God is as present here in his transcendent state as he is in his manifested state. I'll give you one other parallel, which maybe for me is very real. A person passes away, they go to heaven, they go to the Garden of Eden. Where is the Garden of Eden? Where is it? Is it a million miles up, make a left, go a million miles that? Where's the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden is right here. It's right here. It's just in a different dimension. Right? We don't have to go anywhere to experience the different dimension. We just have to be able to enter into that dimension. So if everything, and by the way, this is like, you know, in many mystical practices, this concept is very real. Right? I don't have to go anywhere, I don't have to travel anywhere to experience a deeper dimension. I just have to bring myself to that deeper dimension. I have to enter into that deeper dimension. So why can't I feel it right now? Because I'm not in that dimension. How do I get into that dimension? I don't have to walk anywhere. I have to move my internal system to experience it in a different way. So all that is to say is that there's God as he's personal, in a personal relationship, where we're in a personal relationship with God, where we're conscious of the fact that we are energized and everything is energized in a tailor-made personal way. And then there's a relationship with God as he is transcendent. And in the dimension that God is transcendent, God is encompassing. That's what we call soiviv. It's a surrounding as a metaphor for the fact that it's not internal, it's not personal, it's more abstract.
I'm guessing that's in the first line of the Shema, where the two names of God are juxtaposed.
Sure, beautiful.
That's the same.
Yeah.
Academy.
Yeah, let me elaborate on what you just said. So we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So Hashem, the name Hashem, is a reference to God as he's transcendent. The Yud and the He and the Vav and the He, the Alter Rebbe writes in Shulchan Aruch in the Code of Jewish Law that the Yud and the He and the Vav and the He is an acronym for three words: Haya, Hova, V'yiyah, which means he was, he is, and he will be. What does that mean? He was, he is, and he will be. Meaning all at once, right? All at once, God is, was, and will be. Meaning God is transcendent. Elokeinu, our God, already is a personal God. And the word Elokim, Elokeinu, is God is God of judgment, meaning it's a restrictive manifestation. It's God as he is manifest within the physical reality, within a controlled manifestation, the spiritual and physical realms. So here, O Israel, we might say, oh, these are two separate gods. There's Hashem, the transcendent God, and there's Elokeinu, there's the manifested God. The Shema tells us, no, they're the same God, Hashem Echad. It's the same God. It's one and the same. In the fragmentation, our job is to find the transcendent. That's our job. Our job is to find in the fragmentation, in the personal, to find the transcendent. That's actually the meaning of that verse that we quoted. If you do good, what's he going to do? If you do righteousness, what's he going to give you? And if you do abundant sin, what's he going to do to you? That's not the end of the sentence. The end of the sentence is that that's how it might be experienced. But yes, God chose for our good deeds to make a difference, and God forbid the opposite also to have an impact. Make sense? You have a question?
Thinking about quantum physics.
Beautiful. Tell me more.
Well, no, which has a lot of the same ideas.
Right, and science today is showing us more and more how in the abstract we can affect others and the world. Right, it's not all so linear. Prayer, right? You say, my prayer here is going to help somebody? Yeah, it does. My action here affects somebody on the other end of the world. My positive thinking affects somebody on the other end of the world. By the way, that's also like, it's not so novel if you think about it. If I walk into this room and I'm in a bad mood, you're going to be affected by that. Why? Why should you be affected by my bad mood? I don't have to say a word and you'll be affected by it, because my facial expressions and the energy that I'm putting out is negative. If I walk in here with a smile and a positive, it's going to affect you as well. But I didn't do anything. I didn't hug you. I didn't touch you. I didn't hit you. I just showed up. But it affects you, right? So you're going to say it because I'm consciously seeing it. By the way, you walk into the room and nobody sees you and you're in a negative mood, it affects the room. We experience that if we pay attention to it, let alone, so if that happens in a localized way, why shouldn't it happen across the world? And once it happens across the world, why shouldn't it happen in the spiritual realms as well? In other words, everything is intertwined. It's not in a vacuum. Our actions are so powerful. We are so interconnected.
Butterfly effect.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay, take that in. Moving along. Okay, so so far in this discourse, we asked the question, why Pesach is different than the other holidays. And the second thing the Alter Rebbe explained is the difference between Memale and Soviv, the light that fills and the light that encompasses. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to bring us back to the answer of this question. Regarding the holiday of Pesach, the holiday of Passover, right? Passover, why do we call it Passover? Because God passed over. He passed over the entryways of the Jewish homes. Like the verse says in Shemais and Exodus, that God passed over the doorways, the entryways. Pirish nes his galus ha'ara bebechinas diluk shaloi ayidei hishtalshlus mimadrega lemadrega. The miracle of Pesach, of Passover, is that there was a light that we will coin, that it was the type of light that got revealed was a jumping light, a skipping over light. It skipped over the order of flow, the order of progression. That is, it belongs to the category of encompassing light. Like the verse says in regards to the miracle that transpired at midnight, God says, Va'avarti, and we're going to read this in the Haggadah next week, and I passed over the homes of the Jews, I and not an angel. So let's just for a moment again, let's explain what this means. I'm going to use your visual, but I'm going to use it differently, right? Your visual is like this, okay? No, it's good. It was a good visual. The visual here we're talking about is like this. Not like this, but like this. So I'll elaborate. There's a discourse in the Alter Rebbe the verses, and there's a section in this book of Likutei Torah where the Alter Rebbe has commentary on the book of Song of Songs from King Solomon, and there the verse says, "Medaleg ala harim, mekapetz ala gvois." He jumps on the mountains and he skips through the valleys, or something like that. So the Alter Rebbe has very interesting discussion there. He says, when you walk, right, there's always one foot on the floor. One leg remains on the ground. When you skip, you could for a moment lift both feet off the ground, but it's for a very short moment. When you jump, both feet are lifted off the ground for a more significant amount of time. So the Alter Rebbe says there are three types of levels of revelation, right? There's walking revelation, right, where everything is connected. The one leg leaves the ground, but the other one's still on the ground. So everything flows. There's a process. There's an orderliness to it. Sometimes there's a skipping, where it's a little bit more of an intense revelation. The light is coming a little bit more powerfully, but it's still, as we say in Hebrew, begeder. There's still some boundaries, limitations to it. But when you jump, you completely let go. Completely let go of the prior state of being. And by the way, you mentioned quantum physics. Our service of God throughout the year is a walking service, right? We have a gradual process throughout the year. Change happens very incrementally in a normal fashion. Then you have opportunities in life where you have the opportunity to make a jump, to make a leap. You can make a Pesach. You can jump over right? We encounter those a number of times in our lives where things come our way. We say, I have an opportunity now to make some real change in my life. Usually it comes to us. Sometimes it's an awareness that we have a shift inside of ourselves, and if we capitalize on the moment, we can make some real change in our lives. That's Pesach. We know in Jewish practice, Jewish tradition, and especially in the teachings of Kabbalah, that the number 8 is a transcendent number, right? 7 represents the cycle of the week, the cycle of life. 8 is transcendent. The 8th day of Pesach represents this quantum leap that we can take, which is why the 8th day of Pesach in the diaspora is associated with Mashiach. The Haftorah of the 8th day of Pesach is a prophecy regarding the Messianic era. The Baal Shem Tov introduced the practice of having the Mashiach meal at the end of the holiday. There's an energy about specifically the 8th day of Pesach that's unique. And that's an opportunity where we can take a quantum leap, not just a skip, but a quantum leap. There's those opportunities that come into our lives where we can make real change, not incremental change, not even those opportunities that come every now and then, but once or twice in a person's lifetime, something happens where if they capitalize on it, you can make a real change. And then, by the way, this happens in the universe as well, in history, and things happen around us. Okay, that was a little bit of a sidebar. But back to Pesach. Pesach is a jumping energy, right? Pesach is a jumping energy. That's why it's called jumping. God jumped over the homes of the Jews. The revelation that took place was not an incremental revelation. It was a jumping revelation. Not the type of revelation of Memale, which happens gradually throughout the year, but it's a jumping revelation that takes place only at these times of miracles. It was a revelation of Soiviv, the revelation of this encompassing light.
Does this mean jumping?
Well, I was thinking more. Because in that imagery, right, you're going from heaven to earth. In my imagery, you're going from earth to earth, but to get from one place to the other, you got to jump. But if it works for you the other way, we can stick with that also. Now, why did it need to be this way? Specifically in Egypt, why did there need to be a jumping light? The answer is, come back next week on Sunday, and I'll tell you. So next week we should stay tuned. Next week we'll be able to meet at 10 o'clock, regular time, 10 o'clock. Bagels next Sunday are up in the air. Depends on how clean the building is and how ready we are for Pesach. But coffee there will be. L'chaim. Any questions or comments?